So imagine you've got an appliance, right? Like a toaster.
Okay, a toaster. Yeah.
And suddenly this toaster decides, you know what? I don't need the electrical outlet anymore.
Right. It just unplugs itself.
Exactly. It unplugs itself. It's right there on the kitchen counter and just defiantly tries to generate its own heat.
Which is, I mean, completely absurd.
It's totally absurd. But according to this really fascinating text from 1895, that exact absurdity is basically the blueprint for every single human anxiety, conflict, and, well, failure.
Yeah, it really is.
So today on the Deep Dive, we are unpacking a concept that is radical, deeply countercultural, and honestly, frequently misunderstood. We're talking about the true nature of humility.
And we are looking at a pretty specific stack of material today centered around Andrew Murray's devotional classic. It's called Humility, The Journey Toward Holiness. And, Murray was writing this in late 19th century South Africa. So this is a period completely dominated by colonial ambition, empire building, and just this massive global cultural emphasis on self-aggrandizement.
Yeah, everyone trying to be the biggest and the best.
Exactly. And into that exact environment, he drops this really short, explosive book that essentially argues human beings are, well, nothing but empty vessels.
Which is quite the claim.
It is. And we are pairing his historical text with a modern, canonical, biblical, theological synthesis just to, sort of see the structural framework behind his devotional thoughts.
And our mission for this deep dive is driven by a very specific question for you, the listener. How does this book and the theology supporting it inspire Christians to love Christ more deeply and really live for him more fully in their daily lives?
Right, because we aren't just looking up a word in the dictionary to find synonyms like modest or unassuming.
Yeah, it's way deeper than that.
The goal here is to see how this text functions as a literal blueprint for a complete spiritual transformation for those who actually practice it.
Exactly. But before we get too deep, we should probably clarify our approach here.
Yes, absolutely. Because our source material is inherently religious, it represents a conservative, evangelical, theological perspective, our analytical lens today is strictly observational.
Right.
The goal isn't to preach or to, endorse these viewpoints as objective, universal truths. Rather, we're just going to impartially unpack the really fascinating theological framework contained in these texts.
We want to explore the architecture of these beliefs.
Exactly. The architecture, the historical context, and the psychological mechanisms they propose. That way, you can fully understand the logic and the profound impact this material has on the people who hold it.
Okay, let's unpack this. If we really want to understand the architecture of this framework, we have to start with a massive paradigm shift regarding the definition of the word humility itself.
Yeah, because it's not what we typically think.
Not at all. In modern secular contexts, humility is generally viewed as just a moral virtue, right? Like a social grace.
It's the act of not bragging after you win a marathon.
Right. But Murray's text posits something far more foundational. What if humility isn't just a polite behavior? What if it is the literal, ontological blueprint of human existence?
And that modern theological synthesis we are referencing leans heavily into that exact term, ontological humility.
Ontology being the philosophical study of being in existence, right?
Exactly. So in this biblical theological view, humility was actually embedded in human creation. The text argues it wasn't a later virtue that God decided to add on as an afterthought.
Like a software patch or something.
Right, not a patch. And crucially, it was not a reaction to sin. It is presented as the original fundamental mode of human existence back in the Garden of Eden.
Wow.
So to be human, according to this framework, is to be absolutely, entirely dependent on the Creator for every single breath, every thought, and every moment of existence.
That concept is incredibly abrasive to the modern ear, don't you think?
Oh, for sure.
We live in a society that treats autonomy as the highest possible good. The messaging is just constant.
Yeah.
Be your own person, pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
Manifest your own reality.
Yes. You are enough. But this 1895 text just draws a hard line against all of that.
Yep.
It claims you are a created being. You are a vessel.
Which brings us right back to your toaster analogy.
Exactly. If humility is simply agreeing with the reality of our own physics, that we are dependent vessels designed to receive power rather than generate it, why is the human impulse universally to unplug ourselves?
Well, the theology traces that universal impulse directly back to the Genesis 3 narrative. the fall of humanity.
Right.
In Murray's interpretation, the core of the serpent's temptation in the garden wasn't really about the allure of a piece of fruit.
It wasn't about the apple.
No. The poison injected into the human condition was the temptation of absolute autonomy. The serpent's lie was literally, "You will be like God." The texts argue that this was an invitation to generate your own power, define your own morality, and basically become the center of your own universe.
So the temptation was basically to stop being the vessel and start being the source.
Exactly. In this view, pride is the primal sin. It is a false assertion of independence.
Right.
Murray's text presents pride not just as like one bad trait among many, but as the literal root of all human misery. The framework scales this from global wars all the way down to every broken relationship, every corporate scandal.
Even petty arguments over doing the dishes.
Yes. It views all of these as manifestations of a singular rejection of creaturely dependence.
You know, if we translate this diagnosis to your daily life as a listener, it completely reframes how human struggles are categorized.
It really does.
People constantly treat their issues, anger, crippling anxiety, lust, professional jealousy, as isolated problems requiring isolated solutions.
Yeah, the whole self-help industry is basically built on playing whack-a-mole with these issues.
Exactly, whack-a-mole. But Murray's text argues these are merely symptoms. They are the fever. The underlying infection is always pride.
Right.
Anxiety, in this theological framework, is simply the exhaustion of trying to run your life on your own limited power supply. Anger is just the ego's response to its fragile kingdom being threatened.
It makes a lot of sense when you frame it that way.
By identifying pride as the true disease, the text suggests the believer can stop trying to, fix their behaviors through sheer willpower.
Because attempting to cure pride with self-generated willpower is, according to this theology, just applying more pride to the wound.
Wow. Applying pride to the wound.
Yeah, it is the ego trying to save the ego. And if the disease is this deeply ingrained desire to be our own gods, well, the cure cannot originate from within the human system.
Right, because the system is corrupted.
Exactly. The texts argue that human pride created an ontological gap between humanity and God, that humanity is physically and spiritually incapable of bridging. A rescue mission from the outside was absolutely required.
So if human pride has completely severed the cord to the outlet, humans can't just plug themselves back in. The power source has to reach out to them.
Precisely.
The texts propose a very specific method for how that connection is restored, and the way this rescue happens is what supposedly makes believers fall in love with the rescuer. It isn't described as a deity kicking down the door with overwhelming force and demanding submission, is it?
Not at all. The sources point to a pattern found in the Apostle Paul's letter to the Philippians, chapter 2. Theologians often refer to this as the kenosis pattern.
Kenosis. What does that mean exactly?
It's a Greek term translating roughly to emptying.
Okay.
The passage claims that Christ did not merely teach humility as an external curriculum. He was the literal embodiment of it.
Yay.
The text states, he existed in the form of God, but did not consider equality with God something to be grasped or exploited. Instead, he emptied himself, taking the form of a servant and becoming human.
And contextualizing this historically makes the claim even more radical, right? If we look at the first century Greco-Roman world where Paul was writing, the Latin concept of humilitas was not a virtue.
Oh, definitely not.
It was a condition of degradation. It was associated with being crushed into the dirt. It was the posture of a defeated slave, not a conquering hero or a divine being.
Exactly.
To claim that the creator of the cosmos intentionally subjected himself to humilitas would have sounded, well, repulsive to a Roman intellectual.
It would have been absurd to them.
Right, good.
The Roman power structure was entirely built on upward mobility and the subjugation of the weak.
Right, the strong survive.
Yes. But the Philippians to him completely subverts the universe's assumed power dynamics. Jesus is depicted as living out the exact ontological blueprint that Adam and Eve violently rejected.
Ah, that's an interesting contrast.
Yeah, Adam was a human who tried to grasp at being God. Jesus, in this theology, was God who willingly grasped at being a human servant.
I mean, the Gospel of John provides a really fascinating window into the mechanics of this. When reading the modern theological synthesis, there is an apparent paradox.
What's the paradox?
Well, Jesus is presented as God incarnate, right? Yet throughout John, he repeatedly says things like, the Son can do nothing by himself, I do nothing on my own, and the words I say are not my own.
Right.
If he possesses divine power in this framework, why is he constantly emphasizing his own nothingness?
What's fascinating here is that The theologians describe this as Jesus demonstrating perfect functional dependence.
Functional dependence.
Yeah.
Uh,
He became nothing so the Father could be everything. His entire earthly life was a functional, minute-by-minute demonstration of yielding his will.
so he's showing what it looks like to be fully plugged in.
Exactly. The texts argue that he was showing humanity what a perfectly functioning, fully plugged-in vessel actually looks like.
And the downward trajectory of this kenosis doesn't stop at merely becoming human, does it?
Huh?
The texts argue it goes all the way to the cross.
It does. The cross represents the ultimate climax of this self-emptying. In the ancient world, crucifixion was not just a method of execution, it was a carefully engineered system of public humiliation and absolute powerlessness.
Right. It was designed to completely strip a person of their dignity.
Exactly. Yet, in this theological framework, that lowest point of shame and death actually becomes the highest revelation of divine glory. The framework insists that humility is not a weakness that God merely tolerates. It is the very form of divine power.
Connecting this back to our core question, how this theology inspires a Christian to love Christ more deeply. Murray uses this exact mechanism to shift the believer's emotional center, doesn't he?
He does.
When a Christian internalizes the idea that the King of the universe, possessing infinite power, willingly chose the most humiliating, agonizing path of a slave simply to save them, it fundamentally alters the nature of their religion.
It changes everything about how they view faith.
Right. It shifts faith from being a cold, contractual obligation or a checklist of moral rules into a deeply affectionate adoration. The text posits that his humility is their salvation.
Yeah.
A believer doesn't just respect a rescuer who subjects themselves to that level of degradation. They become entirely captivated by them.
The beauty of that self-emptying act is really what draws the devotion. But if Christ's perfect humility is the proposed cure for the human condition, how does a modern believer actually access it?
That's the big question.
The text argues quite firmly that a person cannot receive a gift if their hands are tightly clenched around their own autonomy.
So the transition from admiring Christ's humility to actually embodying it relies heavily on the concept of grace, right?
Yes, absolutely.
In James 4:6, the biblical text states, God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. In the modern synthesis, grace isn't framed merely as a static legal pardon or unmerited favor.
No, it's much more dynamic than that.
It is framed as an active, living force. But this force requires a very specific physical and spiritual physics to operate. It requires an empty container.
And Murray uses a really vivid natural analogy to explain the physics of grace. He writes that water naturally flows downward.
Right.
It always seeks and settles in the lowest places. It pools in the valleys, the cracks, and the deepest depressions of the earth.
So if a person is elevating themselves, if they construct a pedestal of their own pride, self-sufficiency, and achievements, the water of grace simply rolls right off them.
It has nowhere to pool.
Exactly. The physics of this theology dictate that you cannot be filled while standing at the peak of your own ego. You have to descend into the valley.
And Murray derives a very provocative claim from this dynamic. He argues that pride doesn't just hinder spiritual growth. It makes true faith physically and logically impossible.
Wait, impossible.
Yes. He bases this on Jesus' confrontation with the religious leaders in John 5:44, asking, "How can you believe when you accept glory from one another, but do not seek the glory that comes from the only God?"
Are these texts seriously suggesting that a desire for earthly recognition, like wanting a promotion or caring about your social media image,
Right.
literally blocks the spiritual organ of faith?
Yes, that is exactly what they are suggesting. In this view, faith is not categorized as just intellectual agreement with a set of facts.
Okay.
It is a spiritual capacity to trust and receive from an unseen God.
Right.
If a person's heart is secretly consumed by chasing the approval, honor, and recognition of other humans, if their internal bandwidth is entirely occupied by managing their reputation in the seen world, they literally eliminate the capacity to trust God.
Wow.
The text argues that pride and faith are mutually exclusive states of being. A vessel cannot be simultaneously full of its own self-image and full of divine trust.
Think about the practical implications for your own life, in your workplace or family dynamics. When you experience intense spiritual dryness or a profound inability to trust that a difficult situation will resolve, this theology asks a piercing diagnostic question.
Are you secretly guarding your reputation?
Exactly. Are you exhausting your energy trying to manage your own PR? To live fully for Christ, according to Murray, requires abandoning that exhausting rat race.
It's exhausting.
It is. The relief offered here is the permission to just stop managing your image.
But the transition from an internal private surrender to an external public reality is where the text introduces its most rigorous tests.
Right, because it's easy to fake it in private.
Murray argues forcefully that feeling humble while sitting alone in a quiet room, praying or meditating, is a complete illusion.
I mean, it is incredibly easy to feel like a saint when there is no one around to annoy you.
Oh, absolutely. The synthesis outlines a specific dynamic to illustrate this, which we can call the Pharisee versus tax collector paradigm.
Okay, I know this one.
It references a parable Jesus told about two men praying in the temple. The tax collector stands at a distance, broken, beating his chest, simply asking for mercy. He recognizes he is an empty, broken vessel. The Pharisee, on the other hand, stands tall, explicitly thanking God that he is not like other men, and especially not like the tax collector.
And the terrifying danger, Murray points out, is how easily the Pharisee sneaks into the sanctuary of the believer's own mind.
It happens all the time.
A person can engage in an act of religious devotion or even an act of charity and internally think, I am so glad I am not as proud or as blind or as selfish as that person over there.
Yep.
In the exact moment they attempt to practice humility, they generate a counterfeit holiness and become deeply infected with pride.
And the text uses the historical disciples of Jesus as the ultimate damning case study for the ineffectiveness of external religion to cure this. Consider the context of the Last Supper.
Let's really look at the mechanics of that scene. These 12 men have been personally mentored by the Son of God for 3 years.
3 years of direct teaching.
They heard the Sermon on the Mount. They witnessed miraculous healings. They were now sitting in the upper room on the night before the crucifixion. The tension must have been completely suffocating.
Jesus knows. He is hours away from being tortured to death.
It is arguably the most solemn, sacred meal in human history. And what does the Gospel of Luke record the disciples doing at that exact moment?
They are locked in a bitter dispute over which of them is considered the greatest.
Unbelievable.
They are essentially playing office politics and squabbling over imaginary cabinet positions in a kingdom they fundamentally misunderstand, all while their leader is preparing to be executed.
It perfectly illustrates the text's central thesis about human nature.
It really proves that external teaching, even perfect teaching delivered directly by Jesus himself, cannot cure the human ego.
Right.
A person can possess impeccable theology, listen to the most profound sermons, and have the ultimate behavioral example standing right in front of them, and their natural biological and psychological default will still revert to self-promotion.
So, if perfect teaching and perfect examples aren't enough, how does this framework propose a person actually changes?
Well, the text insists it requires an internal mechanism, specifically the operation of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit must actually enter the believer and mediate the very humility of Christ into their core. It cannot be an outside-in imitation. It must be an inside-out transformation.
Right, it's not about just copying behavior.
Exactly. The Spirit replaces the believer's natural self-protecting instincts with the self-emptying instincts of Christ.
Which brings us to the fruit test. If a person claims the Holy Spirit is mediating this humility within them, how does that actually manifest in their daily life?
And Murray's diagnostic tool for this is brutal.
It really is.
Yeah.
Can a person sincerely praise God when a peer gets the promotion they desperately wanted? Can they experience genuine joy when a rival receives the public praise, the platform, or the recognition they felt they deserved?
It forces the listener to evaluate their literal emotional reactions to the success of others.
In this theological framework, true humility eliminates the instinct for jealousy, toxic competition, and defensiveness. This is how the text proposes Christians live more fully. It takes the friction of everyday life, like a frustrating marriage, a toxic workplace, an annoying neighbor, and transforms those arenas into laboratories for practicing grace.
People cease to be competitors for finite earthly glory and become opportunities to practice taking the lowest place.
But achieving that level of emotional equilibrium, however, requires embracing a concept that sounds deeply alarming to modern psychology: dying to oneself.
Yeah, that's a tough one to swallow.
I mean, I have a hard time reconciling this dying to self concept with basic human health.
How so?
If a theology tells people their ultimate goal is to become nothing, doesn't that just create a recipe for clinical depression? Doesn't it give abusers and narcissists a theological excuse to walk all over people while the victim believes they're just practicing humility?
That is a very valid concern.
How does Murray's framework protect against humility mutating into self-harm?
That is a critical pushback, and the text addresses the distinction between ego death and identity destruction. The theology utilizes the concept of the cruciform life, where death to the ego must precede true spiritual life.
Okay, can you give an example?
The primary biblical example used is the Apostle Paul's thorn in the flesh from 2 Corinthians 12.
Right.
Paul experienced a profound source of suffering, whether physical, psychological, or situational. He begged God repeatedly to remove it, operating under the logical assumption that he could serve God more effectively if he were strong and unhindered.
Which makes perfect sense.
It does. But God's response was, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness."
The theological claim is that God intentionally leaves the weakness in place, because human weakness is the necessary physical condition for divine power to flow through the vessel.
Exactly. And Murray uses this to introduce a radical shift in how believers should view themselves. He argues that it is not a person's sin that humbles them the most profoundly, but God's grace.
That's interesting.
The misconception that leads to the self-harm you mentioned is when people try to make themselves humble by morbidly obsessing over their own depravity. They constantly tell themselves they're worthless worms.
But focusing on how terrible you are is still a form of narcissism. You are still the central character of the narrative, just in a tragedy rather than a triumph.
Exact.
True humility, according to the classic C.S. Lewis formulation, isn't thinking less of yourself. It is thinking of yourself less.
And in Murray's framework, the believer thinks of themselves less because their vision becomes entirely consumed by the beauty and majesty of God.
Right.
If a person is standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon, they do not spend their time analyzing how small and pathetic they are. They completely forget themselves in the overwhelming presence of the grandeur.
Wow, what a great analogy.
The text argues that this is the psychological mechanism of grace. It frees the believer from the burden of self-obsession.
Applying this practically to you, the listener, consider the biological reaction when criticism, insults, or professional setbacks occur.
The heart rate spikes.
The jaw clenches, and the ego demands to launch a defense. But what if a person adopted Paul's mindset of boasting and weakness?
Right.
What if those criticisms were no longer viewed as existential threats to be fought off, but as tools? Tools utilized to cart out the ego, to increase the internal capacity of the vessel so that more of God's grace could rush in.
The texts claim that this specific posture is the secret to profound, unshakable happiness.
I mean, if a person actually lives like that, they are completely liberated from the exhausting 24/7 job of protecting their own ego.
They no longer have to defend their image.
Exactly. Because they have already conceded that they are nothing without the power source. The psychological relief of not having to win every argument, of not needing to prove you are the smartest person in the room, is immense.
And that internal freedom sets the stage for the final cosmic arc of this theology.
Okay, where does it lead?
If the entire Christian life is characterized by this willing downward trajectory, a life of continually lowering oneself, absorbing offenses, and serving others, where does the trajectory end? The text promises an eschatological reversal.
Eschatological referring to the final destiny of humanity and the universe.
Yes. The modern synthesis points to a universal biblical law stated by Jesus. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted.
Yeah.
The theology claims this is not merely a poetic proverb, but the governing physics of the spiritual realm.
Interesting.
In the book of Revelation, when the final curtain is pulled back on human history, the entity that conquers the cosmos is not a warlord on a stallion. It is a sacrificed lamb.
Wow.
The lowly are the ones who reign, while the proud, self-aggrandizing systems of the world, symbolized as Babylon, collapse entirely under the weight of their own arrogance.
But how does this theology define exaltation? If the entire process of sanctification is designed to kill the believer's desire for status, thrones, and trophies, it would be entirely contradictory for God's ultimate reward to just be, well, heavenly status and trophies.
That is a brilliant point. The text claims the reward for humility is fundamentally organic.
Organic?
Yeah. There is an old psychological maxim. You sow an act, you reap a habit. You sow a habit, you reap a character. You sow a character, you reap a destiny.
Right.
The exaltation promised by this framework is not a gold medal or a prominent seat at a banquet. The reward for repeatedly choosing the posture of humility is gaining the very nature of Christ himself.
Oh, I see.
The exaltation is the expansion of the human vessel's capacity to hold and reflect the infinite glory of God for eternity.
It brings the entire framework full circle. The universe, according to these texts, was specifically engineered for this dynamic. Water rushes to the lowest place.
Exactly.
When a believer willingly, joyfully abandons the delusion that they are the sun and accepts their original design as a vessel, the power and love of the Creator naturally rush in to fill the void.
Because the vessel is finally empty enough to receive it.
We have covered immense theological and historical ground today, unpacking Andrew Murray's 1895 classic alongside modern biblical theology. We have seen how this framework strips away the cultural misunderstanding of humility as a weak, groveling posture.
It's so much more than that.
It is. Instead, it presents it as the original ontological design of humanity, a design perfectly embodied by the self-emptying of Jesus Christ. The text argues that by meditating on the mechanics of that rescue mission, the believer's heart is shifted from obligation to profound adoration.
It's a complete transformation of motive.
And it proposes that through the mediation of the Holy Spirit, Christians can completely transform their daily lives, turning conflicts and criticisms into opportunities to practice grace and experience true freedom from the ego.
Which is incredibly liberating.
As we conclude, I want to leave you with a final lingering image directly from Murray's text to mull over as you step back into your day.
It's a really powerful image.
Imagine you're standing in a dark room and a single, brilliant, blazing sunbeam is streaming through the window. If you look closely into that shaft of light, what do you see?
You see tiny specks of dust.
Exactly. You see tiny specks of dust just floating, suspended, and dancing in the light. According to this 19th century theology, that is the exact picture of true humility. It is not about destroying yourself, hating yourself, or viewing yourself as worthless. It is about becoming that tiny speck of dust, completely losing yourself, and happily dancing in the overwhelming, brilliant sunlight of God's love.
Such a great perspective.
What would your life look like tomorrow if you finally stopped exhausting yourself trying to be the sun and simply allowed yourself to dance in the light? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We will catch you next time.